I want to draw our attention for a minute to the way the person of the Holy Spirit spans the Old and the New Covenant. And I want to talk about how he remains the same in certain specifiable ways. And then I want to talk about what changes in his ministry and in the revelation of the Spirit between the Old and the New Covenant. You can picture the Old and New Covenant as one work of God that is delivered in two parts. There's an ancient Christian image. It's an illustration of the two good spies returning from the reconnaissance mission into the Promised Land. So traditionally, Joshua and Caleb being the two spies who brought back a good report from the Promised Land. And part of the blessing that they brought back was, contrary to the other 10 spies who said, no, it's terrible, we'll be destroyed if we go there, the promises of God are bad, we shouldn't go into the land. The two good spies, by faith, saw the promises of God to be good. And we also are told that when they came back from their reconnaissance mission in the Valley of Eshcol, they carried grapes, clusters of grapes so big it took 2 men to carry them. Well, there's a tradition in Christian theology and iconography of Christian art of showing the two good spies carrying a giant cluster of grapes in between them. And then the metaphorical interpretation of this image is that the two who both by faith receive the promises of God represent the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. And in this way of picturing it, the spy in front is carrying a piece of wood and the grapes are hanging behind him. The spy in front represents the Old Covenant. He's under the blessing of the promise. He's supporting the promise. He's claimed it. He's got it. But he's moving forward, and he goes by before the blessing comes. It comes along behind him, and he doesn't even see it as he walks. This is the way the Old Covenant believers lived by faith. The person carrying the back end of that stick from which hangs the cluster of grapes represents New Covenant believers. They too are under the blessing of the promise of God. They too claim it and possess it by faith in God's promises. But as they go, the blessing has already gone along before them, so they see it during their journey. They still walk by faith. They still claim this promise of God by faith, but it has already happened and has gone before them. There's no reason to talk bad about the Old Covenant, but when you are in the position of comparing them, as for instance Hebrews does, you have to call the New Covenant the better covenant. Not to say the Old Covenant was bad, but the New Covenant's better. Because while walking under the same blessing of believing in the promises of God, New Covenant believers get to see the blessing having already gone before them, and in some drawings of this, they even get to partake of it as they go, because some artists will show the man carrying the back of the stick as snacking on the grapes as he walks. The guy in front is under the blessing but doesn't get to see it and can't taste of it on the way in his journey. Well, this represents the Holy Spirit. The promises of God ultimately come true in the Holy Spirit, who is the substance of the promised blessing. That all the work of God is clearing the way for God being with his people in the form of the Spirit who dwells among them. This is partially made known in the Old Testament, but it becomes radically more clear in the New Testament. The 19th century British Methodist theologian William Burt Pope said it this way: "The three divine persons are more or less revealed in the ancient economy, the Old Covenant, but their offices are not clearly and fully distinguished until the last days. The Son and the Spirit were alike in the Old Testament, the promise, and they are alike in the New Testament, sent as fulfillment of the promise." What's interesting here is that there's a way in which the Son and the Spirit are bundled when they are the object of a promise that's coming. You get a few lines of evidence in the Old Testament that talk about, on the one hand, the Messiah, on the other hand, the Spirit, but generally, the promise of God is looked forward to, and it's more or less undifferentiated. As Pope points out, in the New Covenant, both the Son and the Spirit arrive in fulfillment of God's promises. But what we can see once the New Testament revelation is clearly before us is, in addition to there being a great continuity between Old and New Covenant, there's also within that a discontinuity that we need to talk about, that there is something different about being on the back end of that stick of carrying the blessing. And when you're in the New Covenant situation, a distinction becomes clearer between the Son and the Holy Spirit. In John 14, Jesus says, "I will ask the Father, and he will send you another helper to be with you forever, even the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive, because it neither sees him nor knows him. Then Jesus says, you know him, for he dwells with you and will be in you. This verse is frequently seen as a kind of an indication of the distinction, of the discontinuity between the Holy Spirit's Old Covenant ministry, which was real and was actually him, and the Spirit's New Covenant ministry, wherein he enters into a deeper indwelling. Why does he do that? It's on the basis of the finished work of Jesus Christ. When the promise has been fulfilled, the Son and the Spirit are sent together. The Son fulfills, carries out, completes his ministry, and then on that basis, the Spirit goes from being with the people of God to being in them in this new covenant way, only possible because of the finished work of Jesus Christ. So there's continuity and discontinuity in the spanning from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant. And this is important background to get because it really lights up the ministry of the Holy Spirit, who is the same Holy Spirit that God has always promised and has always worked through to bless his people, but who in the New Covenant enters into a new phase of ministry as he takes the lead in operating the economy of God.